Hey guys, Jason here, back with another TCG extended deck profile. Today's feature deck is one of our most beloved and most covered decks. It's Firelight Rush, aka the Outlier. Andrew and I are very impressed with the Outlier this season, and I think it's a solid contender for Season 3's best deck in format. Damien isn't so convinced, since it is the Outlier after all, but I guess we'll let you be the judge. I think Fanu is one of the most famous cards from Set 13, and once we saw the DM13 set list, we knew we had to cover this deck. We've actually changed up this deck quite a bit compared to our last TCG-centric version, because replacing one of the speed attackers with Fanu wouldn't be very interesting. Now let's get into it. We'll start things off with the usual suspects, our favorite one-drop attackers, 4 Deadly Fighter Braidclaw, and 4 Tulk the Oracle. They are one-drop attackers that can swing for face, so they are still the best one-drop attackers for Firelight Rush. Deadly Fighter Braidclaw is preferred over Tulk because the extra 500 power oftentimes makes a difference. Being at 1000 means that many early drops will still have to trade with Deadly Fighter, whereas Tulk always gets attacked over. I also feel like this format has a higher number of 2-drop attackers compared to previous seasons, so bullying Tulk is easier than usual. To finish off the 1-mana cards, we are running max copies of Comet Missile, and while we're on the subject, 4 copies of Rickaboo's Screwdriver. Comet Missile is a bit of a no-brainer since it is the best blocker removal card for Rush decks. Rickaboo's Screwdriver is probably the more interesting card to talk about here. It's a great 2-drop, and I'm surprised this is the first time we're featuring it in one of our TCG decks. I want to say the main reason we've opted to not play it is because its effect is not immediate. We're all about that instant gratification, so we usually prefer Volcanic Arrows. But this time around, we've decided to change things up and run it over Volcanic Arrows instead. It is delayed gratification, but it has a lot of upside. I think having a reusable effect makes sense in this particular build, since we aren't running Larbagear, who can deal with multiple blockers at once, and, being an early drop that can swing for face is always appreciated. Speaking of early drops, our other 2-drop attackers are Kook Palon and newcomer Zachary Ranbarius, or Zacharanba Swordfighter. As I touched on earlier, we changed up the style of this deck for this latest version. We removed the Guardian package and are instead opting to use efficient creatures to break through. Kook Palon, while fairly weak in power, is just a really strong card. Decks that don't have blockers or removal will really struggle to deal with it. Most of this season is focused on creature versus creature combat, and because of how our format has evolved, most of the destruction spells cost 6 mana, so there are even fewer ways to permanently remove Kook Palon. Zacharanba is a new addition to the deck, and can functionally act as a 2-mana 3k vanilla. You need all the cards in your mana zone to be tapped for him to stay at 3000 power, but this is pretty easy in the early to mid stages of the game. Aside from being difficult to revenge kill, another added benefit of the 3k power level is that he can trade with some of the early blockers, like Belix and, more importantly, Juliana. The removal of Larbagear means that the blocker hate cards in this deck don't work on Juliana, so the ability to trade with it is extremely valuable. Moving on, what would a Rush deck be without speed attackers? The speed attackers of choice this time around are the mascot of the deck, Fanu Bloody Winds Officer, and good old Pyrofighter Magnus. We really like Fanu here because having 3500 power is huge. It's surprisingly difficult to get rid of, can attack over most early blockers, and doesn't get destroyed by Judgment. It does have a drawback effect, which technically allows it to be revenge killed by other creatures, especially shield trigger creatures, but it at least replaces itself, in the sense that the opponent usually has to break a shield to do it, thus giving us an extra card. We really like it in this deck, and Andrew even thinks Fanu puts the Outlier on par with the almighty Fire Nature Rush. For the second speed attacker, I much prefer Pyro over Rickaboo, even though I don't think you can really go wrong with either one. I think Andrew tends to prefer Rikaboo because it stays on the field, but I don't put a lot of importance on Rikaboo's board presence since it's easy to remove and can't attack over anything. I already touched on the importance of trading with the likes of Juliana, which Pyro can do, but another reason I think he has merit over Rikaboo is because he's generally more difficult to deal with. A handful of decks, especially in Season 3, don't have ways to properly deal with Pyro, so he basically puts them on a timer. I think this improves the matchup spread by a lot, so Pyro seems objectively better. As for playing all three aforementioned speed attackers, we did briefly try a build that ran max copies of all, but that was too much. I do think there could be some sort of sweet spot in running more than 8 and less than 12, but for the sake of simplicity, we've just kept it to 2 playsets. And to round things off, we've got max copies of Colon the Oracle and max copies of Holiaw. I'll talk about Holiaw first. Holiaw always gives us a chance and consistently allows us to threaten game when the opponent is on 0 shields, which isn't uncommon. For instance, if the opponent breaks into it while trying to win, even if they do clear the board, the Outlier can still win off one speed attacker. Many Japanese lists, such as Firelight Rush decks in DMP and the famous Ohinata Rush list from the OCG, use Holiaw, so I want to say the concept of Holiaw and Rush is well established. I suppose another application of Holiaw is in those sweaty draw pass situations. If the opponent is trying to stall, as long as there's a creature on board, it is theoretically an out to charge a 6 mana and then Holiaw for game. Colon, I guess you could say, is a bit of a strange inclusion in that it isn't quite as fast as the other cards in the deck, and it doesn't grant as much plot armor as Holiaw. But falling somewhere in the middle isn't so bad. Hitting 4 mana with this deck isn't too difficult, so hard casting Colon to get past the blocker, though not as good as Volcanic Arrows, can still be a decent play because you get the body. Colon is also a shield trigger creature that can stop an attack, so it has this Aqua Surfer-like quality in that it can cause reversals if the opponent breaks into it. Other than that, perhaps the most convincing argument of all, it's good for light mana. So here's a nice bird's eye view of the deck. It is a rush deck, so I think it's pretty simple to play. You play your 1 drops on 1, your 2 drops on 2, your speed attackers on 3. We typically want to swing for face, and it's a good time. We usually expect the game to be over or the opponent to be on 0 shields by turn 5 or at around that point, and the deck has a lot of top decks that can close out games like Colon, Comet Missile, a speed attacker, etc. Choosing which 2-drop to play on 2, though, can often require some thought. If the opponent runs blockers, Screwdriver and Zach Ranba are the preferred options, and if the opponent is likely to trade with their weenies, Kukpalon and Zach Ranba should be prioritized. I'd say Zach Ranba is the most versatile of the 2-drops, and it's important to always keep its effect requirement in mind. Also, something I think is worth noting for rush decks, especially in consideration of Zach Ranba's effect, is that charging every turn may not always be necessary. While on the subject, staying on 3 mana is usually a good idea, since it is the bare minimum needed to play a speed attacker. An additional charge on 3 also allows for Colon or 2 2-drops, which can be strong plays. In terms of matchups, I think this beats everything in the current pool because it's very fast, very consistent, and has strong creatures. The usual anti-rush fare can give it problems though, like early blockers, Spiral Gate, and especially Juliana. Shield triggers also cause problems, but that's really just every aggressive deck in general, and not an issue unique to the Outlier. In terms of specific matchups, I'd say this deck typically trades games with Bounce Rush, but the Outlier might be favored because it's faster. Wave Strikers are surprisingly competitive against this as well, but the matchup is very dependent on how quickly Merly can make an appearance. Merly attacks over both 1-drop attackers, and puts Azra out of Comet Missile's range. However, aside from its usual strengths, Holiaw lets the Outlier play around air quotes, unbreakable boards. In terms of other options, I think there are actually quite a few ways to configure Firelight Rush, so I'll be showing off a few different lists. Also, here's perhaps the final obligatory mention of volcanic arrows. This was meant to be a different take on the Outlier to what we previously had, and I do think there is merit to playing Fanu with the tap cards over the Guardian package. However, if you want to play a list with both Fanu and the Guardians, you could play our old list and just replace Rikaboo or Pyro with Fanu. If you want something spicier, the Ohinata Rush list I mentioned at the start of the video is the most famous OCG Firelight Rush deck from this era. It's optimized for fighting Bombazar, so it uses cards like Holiaw and Jawarka. But there are some funny cards present as well to help play around shield triggers like Migalo and Win the Oracle. And for the TCG loyalists who might want to try a Firelight Rush list without the Guardian package, here are some changes that are the next closest thing. The Zakranbas have been replaced with Snip Striker Bullraiser, as both are 2-mana 3k attackers that can swing for face, and Fanu was booted for Rikaboo since, well, it's another 3-drop speed attacker. And that brings me to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was certainly interesting for me to see the Outlier with a completely new coat of paint, so to speak, since, well, it's a rush deck, they tend to be straightforward, but I actually ended up changing like 16 to 20 cards compared to our last TCG-centric list. Anyway, as usual, thank you guys so much for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.